Thank you ever so much to everybody for joining us today. Good afternoon and welcome to our final session of the day. It's Good Governance in 2021. We've had lots of people sign up for this session, so a really popular one. My name is Hannah Stolten and I'm the Chief Executive here at Governors for Schools. For those who are visually impaired, we'll be sharing a brief audio description of ourselves before we begin. I'm chairing today's panel. I'm female, white British, mid-40s with short brown hair and glasses. Before I introduce each of our panellists, we'll share a few housekeeping notes. Should you need them, closed captions are available. You just need to switch them on yourself at the bottom. Speakers have been invited to share a short verbal description, as I said. The chat function is disabled. However, you can post any questions that you have into the Q&A panel, and we'll get to those at the end. The session is being recorded. Links to the video will be sent out, and we'll also send links to slides and resources and also contact details for our guest speakers. Please do continue to follow our conference over the course of the week and like and share the content on social media. If you can use the hashtag GfS Conference 21, that would be great. And at the end of the session, we will share a short post-session survey. So if you could complete that for us so that we can improve on our sessions, that would be great. Thank you. So we've invited our panelists today to talk about good governance in 2021. We wanted to think about what planning and preparation we should be doing for our meetings. And so we have invited three panelists to share their thoughts on what our key priorities should be. Joining us today, we have Sujal Zaveri. Sujal started her career in governance as a parent governor and later chair of governors for 10 years. Sujal currently manages governor services in Enfield. We then have Steve Barker. Steve is the head of governance services at Better Governor and he's contributed to many national governance initiatives, including being part of the team commissioned by the National College of Teaching and Leadership to develop external reviews of governance. Finally, we have Kirstie Barrett. Kirstie is the head teacher of a Barnet community school. She has over 20 years of teaching experience throughout the primary age range. She's worked in Southwark, Tower Hamlets and Hackney and has been a member of different governing boards. She's now the chair of primary school in a multi-academy trust. Kirstie is briefly delayed, but we're hoping she'll be able to join us shortly. Obviously, end of the school day is not a great time for teachers, so we hope to have her online soon. We are, however, starting with Sujal, so I'm going to hand over straight to you, Sujal.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you so much for inviting me today and giving me the opportunity to speak to so many of you. I'd like to start by saying that I'm Asian, middle-aged. I have a short dark bob and glasses. I'd like to start the session with a question. Do you consider yourself to be a good governor? I think the fact that you're all here today and given up your time as volunteers proves that you are. Mahatma Gandhi once said, "Be the change that you want to see in the world." And I think that applies to us as governors. There are about 300,000 or so governors across England, and they need to be applauded warmly for the tremendous work that they have done in keeping business going as usual over the last 18 months. What is governance? A recent poll indicated that the two words that came to mind were oversee and accountability. And I think that's quite an accurate picture of governance. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Just a quick reminder of the change in the role of governors over the years. Many years ago, governance used to be about governors going into the school office, having a cup of tea and a chat with the head teacher to discuss their problems. So it was much more of a supportive role. Now, it's become much more involved, challenging, and skilled. And through the pandemic, although business did carry on as usual, the emphasis on support was reintroduced. And personally, I hope that in the future, we can get more of a balance of support and challenge. Next slide, please. A quick overview of the core functions that I'm sure you're all aware of. Vision, educational performance, and financial accountability. I noticed recently that the NGA has said they recognize a fourth one, which is voices of stakeholders. Now, you may or may not agree with this, but it has definitely provided some food for thought. Next slide, please. The school community is a collection of stakeholders, with pupils being at the heart, parents who raise the child, staff and senior leadership who teach the child, and us governors who oversee. As the saying goes, it takes a village to raise a child, and together we empower these children, our next generation, with their life skills. So it is very important that our stakeholders, all these stakeholders, have a voice and are confident. Now, as stakeholders, we are all aware of recent changes in education and the need to provide a fair education. So I'm going to focus on a couple of things that I think are important for this year. Next slide, please. The tragic murder of George Floyd was a catalyst for change across the world. It resulted in many of us in governance arranging unconscious bias sessions to self-reflect, to increase awareness, and debate about the need to be more inclusive. Hope that many of you had a chance to attend these sessions. Do you know if the staff in your schools have had a chance to attend these training sessions? Have they been offered such sessions? Equality, diversity, and inclusion is referred to as EDI, and there has been a massive focus on this in recent times. It's raised awareness of many cultural groups to question their own knowledge about themselves and their heritage. It has made senior leaders question the richness and inclusivity of their own curriculums. And a phenomenal amount of work has been done to help the school community with this. Could we have the next slide, please? And this shows the 9 characteristics. These are the 9 protected characteristics. I'll just give you a few seconds to look at them. I think it's really important that we keep the momentum going and not just use what we have learned and discussed over the last year and keep going with it. Next slide, please. In order to keep this momentum going, it needs to be multidimensional. As I've shown in the cube, diversity needs to be threaded through all the functions of the governing board. For example, with a vision, is this a result of collective input? Does it reflect inclusive practice? Educational performance. How do we improve the educational performance of our pupils? By providing opportunities to all the pupils and all the staff, by having role models, by creating opportunities for everybody. For example, do you know how your staff feel about opportunities? Financial accountability. Are we making the best use of resources for all our pupils? Is pupil premium money being spent relevantly and having an impact on all the focus groups? Have we got any unmet needs that we need to identify? You might ask me what the benefits of EDI are. Now, studies have shown, for example, that BAME teachers have a higher expectations from BAME students. Studies have shown that it's important for all pupils to have role models that reflect their own characteristics. A recent survey by Eduro highlighted the following. The survey included 16,500 members of staff, so it was a fairly large survey. Just under half of all staff, 43%, considered their staff body very or quite diverse, and only a quarter believed that it was not diverse or not diverse at all. Furthermore, only a third of staff members considered that the diversity of their school staff body was representative of their student population. Now, to me, this shows there is a need for change. And as governors, you could request data on your own school demographics and then make your decisions accordingly. We also need to remember that it's not just about recruiting. We need to have an emphasis on retention, and this applies both to staff and to governors. With governors, for example, have you got adequate succession planning? Have you ensured that all your governors are given the opportunity to be chairs of committees, to be the chair of governors? If they are not given this opportunity, how do you think this behavior would make them feel? Have you got a skills audit that includes EDI? Do you, for example, conduct an exit interview? Have you got a link governor for EDI? Now I'm going to move on to the second area that I would like to mention. Could I have the next slide, please? It has been a tough time for head teachers, for SLT, and for the whole school community. So do please sustain the emphasis on well-being. A recent report by NEU on 10,000 staff stated that 35% of staff said they would not be in education in the next 5 years, and 66% said that the status of the profession had got worse. This to me indicates the morale, and hence the focus on well-being really does need to be sustained. Next slide, please. How can we help each other and the school community? It's really quite simple. Watch out for signs of stress and try to help. Make sure as governors that you are asking the right questions about pupil well-being. Is there a clear policy to recognize and address this issue? Are your governor colleagues coping? Here at Enfield, we'd held a well-being session for chairs, which was really well received, and they really appreciated issues being heard and experiences exchanged. How about you think about having a link governor for well-being as well as a link governor for EDI? Next slide, please. Now, there were many positives of COVID, and virtual meetings were one of them. Virtual meetings did mean that they were much more inclusive, and for many who struggled to attend meetings and training sessions for reasons of disability or childcare, virtual meetings were great. Online training has allowed us access to trainers from across the country, making our pool of trainers much more diverse. But please don't forget that home can be a hostile environment for some people, so flexibility is key and good communication is vital. Please do not make assumptions because they're so easily made. Consider, for example, combining face-to-face meetings with online meetings. Next slide, please. And I'll finish with what I said at the start. Be the change that you want to see in the world. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you so much, Sujal. That was really interesting and really good takeaway points there, I think, that we'll probably come back to in the questions. Kirstie has joined us, which is great. Thank you, Kirstie. But we'll hand over to Steve first for his slides. Over to you, Steve.
My name is Steve Barker. I like to think I'm middle-aged. I'm probably the top end of middle age. Everybody else has described their hair colour. Mine's easy. I haven't got much of it, but what I have got is actually, my children tell me it's pure white as the driven snow these days. That's probably all you need to know about me, folks. As I say, my name is Steve Barker, and I'm head of Better Governor. I'm also head of the governance consultancy at an organisation called Strictly Education. And I'm also a governor of quite a considerable number of years experience now. This is, in fact, in a month's time, I've been a governor for 30 years, which I think is something of an achievement. My children think it makes me a desperately sad person, but for all of those reasons that Sujal gave us, why governance matters, why governance should be effective, I still like to keep my governor roles going. I'm the governor of 4 different schools at the moment for my sins, and hopefully I can impart some of my thoughts with you in the next 15 minutes or so. So if we move on to my first slide, what I've tried to do on my slides is take you on a little bit of a journey, and I'm going to start off by talking about what I call the benchmarks for good. Well, you see I put that in brackets. Good governance means effective governance, in my view. So that's the tact I'm taking. So forgive me if I use those words interchangeably. I then want to think a little bit about some of the key messages for us as governors in terms of how we conduct ourselves against that backdrop that Sujal articulated so well on that last part of the session. I want to say a little bit more about COVID, more from the perspective of perhaps some of the lessons that we've learned in terms of how we can grasp those and take those forward in terms of contributing towards effective governance as we move into the back end of 2021 into 2022. And then I want to finish off by talking about what I think are some of the key themes in governance as we sit here now in the autumn term of 2021. And I don't know, Hannah, if I'm allowed to give a plug for the session I'm delivering for you tomorrow morning as well, but building on that, I'm doing a hot topic session at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. So if you haven't already booked, feel free to do so. And what we'll be doing there is exploring some of those themes in a lot more detail. But I want to start off to say, for me, what is good governance, what is effective governance all about? And I think you can do a lot worse by referencing the 2 documents that I've actually got on the slide that's in front of you at the moment. Governance Handbook on the left-hand side. We are told there is a new one about to be published because of all of the changes in the personnel at the department last week. I'm guessing that's going to be put back a little bit now. But nonetheless, this is the version we have at the moment, was updated in October last year. And the Governance Handbook, although it's not statutory, it is a very good background reference guide to everything that you need to know about governance, whether that be in a maintained school or in a multi-academy trust setting. And that, to my mind, should be complemented by the publication on the right-hand side of the slide. And those of you that have perhaps joined some of the webinars that I've led for Governance for Schools in the past will know this is a favourite of mine. Competency Framework for Governance, it's called, dates back to 2017. Don't let that put you off its relevance for governance today in 2021. It's as relevant today as it ever was in my mind. And I think what this does, it actually sets out a very aspirational model of governance. It looks at the competencies that the Department for Education expects effective or good governance to actually be characterised by in all of our schools. Again, common for academies as well as for maintained schools. So if perhaps we can move on to my next slide now, and what I've done here is taken some of the key messages that I think come out of those 2 publications, and I've given you a little 2 postage stamp versions of those in the top right-hand portion of the screen there. Sujal mentioned the core functions. I think understanding the core functions of governance, what they mean, that strategic overview, not confusing the operational role of those people who are paid in our schools with what it means to be a governor operating at that strategic level, absolutely crucial, of course. And as is the accountability, both for finances, but of course, most important of all, that accountability for pupil performance. And I use similar language to Sujal. I always say that pupil progress, pupils are at the heart of everything that the education system is all about. That goes for our work as governors too. And I also think it's important that we don't lose sight of the fact that the work of governance should be underpinned by values. All of our schools operate on sets of values, a lot of them very common. Values ought to permeate through all of governance, and the values that are probably uppermost in my mind at this point in time are those that are pinned to the what are called the Nolan principles for public life. Many of us don't necessarily like to think about it this way, but we are public servants as such, as governors. We might be unpaid, but we actually are offering our service, and it is in a public role, and therefore those Nolan principles apply to each and every one of us, but also apply to us collectively in terms of the way in which we conduct ourselves as governors and as governing boards. And I think for me, it never does us any harm to remind ourselves what those Nolan principles are. And I'd like to think that most of you, and most of you in your schools represented by the various boards that you serve on today, do have a governance code of conduct, which is underpinned by those principles and some of the characteristics and attributes that are incumbent within those. I would say this because a lot of my working life is actually spent engaging in professional development with governors, but of course it is essential. If we are to take our roles seriously as governors, we need to ensure that our knowledge is up to date. We need to ensure that we are constantly keeping a pace with the changes that happen in education, and education is a dynamic process. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind about that. Therefore, it's important as governors that we value the contribution that our own professional development makes. If you think about the professional development that happens in schools, that's an ongoing process that happens week in, week out. Teachers are constantly learning, teaching and learning support staff are constantly updating their knowledge. And actually, as governors, we should be doing the same. And I know many of you are doing that. And I realize I'm speaking or preaching, rather, I should say, to the converted this afternoon, because you've always taken the trouble to actually come along to this webinar, which is fantastic. Coming out of that training, I think, is that quest for deepening our knowledge as governors. And that comes out of asking questions. I've been off today doing a governance review in a multi-academy trust. And one of the things that became very obvious to me when I first started the arm's length background work for this was that there wasn't much evidence in this particular organisation of governors asking what I would call the right questions. There are questions that we can all ask, but what we ought to be thinking about is, are we asking questions that take governance forward? Are we asking questions that deepen the knowledge base of governors so that we actually have a better understanding of our work in our schools? And we know that when we're making decisions, we're making those decisions based on sound evidence, on sound understanding of how our schools operate. I do think that what we should be doing in terms of trying to characterise effective governance in our school is also linked to the way in which we organise ourselves. And my next bullet point there, the penultimate one on this slide, really is actually aimed at that. Is our structure fit for purpose? In other words, does it serve us appropriately in terms of the way in which governors are expected to work in 2021? If you've been a governor as long as me, and I recognise that most of you are probably far younger than I am, so you may not have been, but if you've been a governor as long as me, you might actually recall that there was a time when governors were expected to have 4 committees. We had a curriculum committee, a staffing committee, a premises committee, and a finance committee. Sorry if I said that twice, haven't I? No, that's right, those 4 committees. Many governing bodies adapted that in the probably mid to late 90s. That model I've just described has been around since middle of the 1980s. And the Appropriate Education Act back then. In the 90s, lots of governing bodies were persuaded by me amongst other people to think about adopting a two-tier setup, which actually had perhaps a children and learning committee or something that appropriated that, and then a finance or a resources committee alongside. I think we've got to a stage now where many governing bodies are holding the mirror up and saying, well, actually, does that system suit us? Does that structure actually equip us to actually know what we're expected to know as governors across the piece? And although Sir Michael Wilshaw, when he was Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, the head of Ofsted a few years back, made it very clear that he felt that governors weren't balanced enough in their overall knowledge of their schools. And that led me to thinking, and I introduced a system in some of the schools here in Surrey, where I'm based, where we did away with committees completely. And the idea was that it wasn't good enough anymore, that governors said, well, don't talk to me about finance. I serve on the Children and Learning Committee or on the Standards Committee, or don't talk to me about standards because actually I'm a finance governor. That's not enough. Governance in 2021, good governance, effective governance in 2021 is actually all of us having a much broader understanding of what those key performance indicators in our schools ought to be. So part of that for me is about asking that question, when did we last think about the structure that we've got? Do we need those? Do we need as many committees as we've got? Are they the right committees? Or should we try a structure that has no committees at all and the whole governing board meets perhaps twice a term or once a month, something like that? you might want to think about that alongside workload and work-life balance for your head teachers as well, because often that can actually lead to far fewer meetings for everybody. And then my last bullet point here, for me, a real key message right now, building on from the teacher workload agenda, which has been around for a while now, certainly predates COVID, but I think its importance has actually been highlighted during the pandemic without any doubt whatsoever. So my next slide is actually going to talk about that a little bit. So if we could flick the slides on, thank you. So for me, as I say, Sujal touched on some of the realities of the pandemic. What I want to do, and again, there's a slight overlap, but hopefully we haven't overlapped too much here. Yes, it did lead to many of us having shorter meetings. The guidance from the Department for Education at the time said meetings should be focused on the urgent and time bound, and that led lots of us to try and have far more focused meetings. And I think because of that, a lot of them became a lot more positive. They became more positive in terms of their productivity, but also more positive in terms of governors feeling that something had been achieved from them. We need to remember all of those aspects like inclusivity, etc. We want everybody to participate, but actually we can do that in a far briefer period of time. And I think that's one of the things that we should have learned out of the pandemic. Workload, as Sujal mentioned, is a reality. Governance can impact on that, because I think if we think about, linked to some of those bullet points on my previous slide, have we got the right structure? Could we have fewer meetings? Could we have shorter meetings? I think those are certainly they're positive questions, and if the answers of them are what I would say are the right answers, then I think it can make a very real impact on workload for not just head teachers, but lots of members of senior leadership teams as well, who are participating in our meetings often. But, and it is a big but, in order for that to happen, as governors, we need to actually shoulder some of the responsibility. And I think for me, effective governance, good governance in 2021, in terms of shouldering that responsibility, says I need to take some responsibility myself as an individual for making sure I go into every meeting, every governance meeting, as prepared as I possibly can be. So I will engage in my own professional development. I do that all the time when I'm preparing to deliver it to others, of course, but yeah, that's important. My own professional development is such that I think it arms me with the ability then to be able to ask those searching questions that deepen not just my knowledge, but the knowledge of everybody else who hears the responses to them. I will read all of the papers before I go into a meeting, because I don't expect anybody to actually read them for me once I get there, which I always say when I do induction training for new governors, preparation is everything. And the most depressing sound in governance is when, in the old days when we had face-to-face meetings and the chair would call the meeting to order, and the first noise you heard was the tearing open of 13 envelopes. Hopefully we're a lot beyond that. I'm sure I'm preaching to converted again in actually saying that this afternoon to you. But serious point for me is that if we're properly prepared, the meetings will be more effective. There is no doubt about that. Effective meetings are characterized exactly by what Sujal said, and inclusive practice is everything. It's all of those things that Sujal said, but it's also making sure that we're inclusive of every voice on the governing body. We're giving people. So if you're a chair, when was the last time you thought about, has everybody contributed to it? Have we given people, even the quietest voices, the opportunity to be heard? Because that doesn't always happen, I don't think. And above all else, of course, informed governors make informed decisions. That's what governance is actually all about. It's about decision making and shouldering the responsibility that comes with that role of decision making. And I think the more informed that we can be, and I think we've demonstrated during COVID that we have the ability to learn more, to understand more, to reflect our school's context, the more we know, the better the quality of those decisions are actually going to be. And if we move on to my next slide now, if we may, please. This is where I've touched on what I think good governors, good governing boards, effective governing boards are talking about or should be talking about this term. Pupil performance has got to be on the agenda for us. I think there are too many schools, and I speak to governors virtually every day of my life, I think, either electronically or on the phone, etc. And I am hearing far too much for the last 6-7 months or so that, well, because we didn't do tests last year, because public examinations were not quite done the way in which they've been done historically, pupil performance hasn't really been on the agenda for us. We're not having assessment data reported to us. That is wrong. That is plain wrong. Come back to what Sujal said. Pupil performance, children in our schools, young people in our schools are at the heart of everything we are all about. The business of schools is children and young people's learning. We cannot allow governance to continue without that renewed focus on pupil performance. So I urge each and every one of you, if it's not on the agenda this term, you should be talking about what assessment told teachers, what assessment told senior leaders and head teachers in your schools last term. Where does that take you this term? A lot of that will be talking about perhaps some of those emergent gaps that have appeared, but what are our schools doing about that? How are schools actually making those interventions work so that those gaps are actually reduced and hopefully ultimately closed? Safeguarding never goes away. Of course, safeguarding is always on our radar, or should be as governors. There is, I'm sure you're all very aware, a new edition of Keeping Children Safe in Education, which is the Bible of safeguarding for each and every one of us. And of course, that's got a renewed focus in the current edition on peer-on-peer sexual abuse, apart from anything else. That is very much flavour of the month, of the 6 months probably of the year, as far as Ofsted and the department are concerned at the moment. We'll all be aware of the catalyst for that, the Everyone's Invited website, etc. There is a real issue in schools, and governors have a very real responsibility to take on board in terms of ensuring that it is on the agenda, that every school, irrespective of the age of the pupils, has a responsibility here in terms of preparing children and young people for adult life and all that that means in terms of a responsible adult life, so that hopefully we can educate, we can build resilience, we can prepare children and young people for later life, so that peer-on-peer sexual abuse does not become a permanent feature of that. COVID doesn't go away, of course, and therefore we should also be talking about our outbreak management plans or contingency plans, depending on which you prefer to call them. But many of you will be in parts of the country where you'll know that the local infection rates, the local COVID context is changing rapidly at the moment. The numbers are creeping up slowly on a daily basis. Conveniently for the government, there's lots of other things going on in the news at the moment, so you may have actually lost sight of that. But with schools back, with universities about to go back, there are concerns that there will be more and more reasons why schools are having to engage remote learning again, are potentially faced with closing either classes or year groups because of insufficient staffing, etc. Our schools should have those plans in place in order to make that a reality, and in order to actually have the ability to switch that on at a moment's notice. So if a child is not in school tomorrow because they're isolating or because they've got symptoms, there ought to be a way that governors have the assurance that the outbreak management plan says, we know what we're going to do, we know how we're going to respond, and that's something we're familiar with. And of course, don't lose sight of the fact that the curriculum hasn't gone away. Ofsted launched their new framework, as it was at the time, back in September 2019. It's still the same framework. It still has the curriculum as its backbone, and that doesn't go away at all. Okay, if you move on to my last slide now, please, Ollie, that'd be great. Thank you. I just wanted to say a quick word before I finished, if I may, just about what our role is as governors in terms of asking questions. Questions are the way in which we demonstrate our accountability. One thing that I don't very often tell people anymore, but part of my work over the last few years has been that, apart from anything else, I operate as a what's called a performance coach. If you could see me below the neck, I mean, you might go into I put on a little bit of extra weight. My shirts don't fit anymore during the pandemic, but it's nothing to do, performance coaching, with my physical prowess. Far from it. In fact, it's all about helping people improve their performance in the workplace. I spend a lot of time doing coaching in an educational settings. And one of the things that I will say to people is you have to recognize that as a discipline, coaching's not like mentoring. Mentoring is where you give somebody who's got more experience perhaps than somebody else the opportunity to impart some of that knowledge, that wisdom, experience onto a lesser experienced person. Coaching helps in the same way, but coaching is actually about helping people find their own answers. So coaching requires far more questioning than it does providing answers. And so it's all about people finding their own way forward. And the cardinal rule of questioning in coaching terms is that you should never ask a question that begins with the word why. And I think, and I don't mean this in any patronizing way at all, but think about head teachers' well-being, think about head teachers' workload. If you're asking somebody a question why, inevitably it becomes very inquisitional. And you think about in an education setting, good example is you say to a child, why did you do that? Already it's loaded with a bit of intonation that says, I don't think you should have done that, and therefore I'm asking you to justify to me why you did. And if you just pause for a moment, each and every one of you, and say, if somebody says to you, why did you say that? Why did you do that? Why do you think that? We immediately, internally, even if you don't recognize it, always go on the defensive. If you say to somebody, what prompts you to say that? Or that's interesting. What makes you act in that particular way, or with that particular thought, etc.? It's a far more open question. And I think as governors, if we take that on board and think about it, rather than actually asking a head teacher, why didn't boys perform better in writing last year, which is a fairly confrontational way of doing it. Hopefully you can, if you turn the question around and make it a what question, say, well, what were the factors that prevented boys, performing as well as girls? That's a, please tell me a bit more. I'm interested. I want to find out. So that's my free tip. If you were coaching clients, I'd charge you £50 for that, but you get that for free this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. But seriously, think about it, use it. It's a much better way of actually deepening your knowledge as a governor and becoming more effective. That's all I want to say. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you ever so much, Steve. Just before I let you go and move on to Kirstie, could you just repeat what the 4 original committees were?
The 4 original committees, there was a finance committee, a curriculum committee, a staffing committee, and a premises committee.
Thank you. Lovely.
I hope I got that right the first time. If I didn't, I apologise profusely.
No problem at all. We have got some other questions, but we'll come back after Kirstie. So Kirstie, I'll hand over across to you now.
Lovely, thank you. I probably need to begin by apologising for not having a very sophisticated slideshow for everybody. I think I kept Craig on his toes because I'm a head teacher of a primary school with a resource provision in Barrett. I'm the chair of governors of a primary school in Enfield in a multi-academy trust. And I've got 3 primary school children of my own. So I am super busy. And I think one of the things that working through the pandemic is kind of one of the realizations I've had is that in education, normally we're really forward thinking. So we're always prepared for next week, next month, next term. And I think the pandemic has made every day just in the moment. So we're always thinking about what families need help today, what children need help today, what are we going to do today? And I think that forward thinking and forward planning we're not able to do in the same way. And I think that has made it quite tricky in terms of workload for senior staff in schools. So I am a governor of a multi-academy trust. I've never worked in a multi-academy trust. I've always worked in a community school. So the difference is interesting for me. But I decided to be a governor of another school because I felt it was really important for a teacher that wasn't part of that school to be on that governing body. Because I was a head teacher in Hackney previously, and it was quite a culture in Hackney. And I feel like whilst it's amazing to have all these different professionals on your governing body, you know, lawyers, mums, accountants, lots of different professionals, actually having somebody from another school is really helpful to the head teacher of the school. Just to give like a comparative about what it's like somewhere else that's quite similar, and I think staff governors don't quite do that. So for me, when I was asked a question about good governance in 2021, I thought of two things. I thought about the governing body, and I was thinking, do it better than you've ever done it before. And the second thing was really focusing on the children. So when I mean do it better than ever before, I think governors have attended meetings better in my experience than ever before, but they've attended virtually, so they haven't been in schools. And I think it's really important that this term, given the climate, that governors come into schools. Partly because I think you need to show solidarity to the staff that you manage and lead as governors, that you're prepared to come into the school that they've been in for the last 18 months. But also because I think many changes will have happened that you won't have seen while you were taking part in virtual meetings. You won't have seen how the children are, how things might have moved forward in the time when the meetings were virtual. And I think that is extremely important. And I also think that the meetings, and I think it's been touched on before, we need to think a little bit more creatively about the meetings. So the head teachers report to governors. The thing that makes me saddest as a head teacher is when I'm asked to read it out at a governor's meeting, and I think that isn't my job. I've probably spent about 6 hours writing that report for everybody to read. I understand that report inside out, upside down, and it would take me 10 minutes to summarize it, but I've written it for governors. So I think reading the paperwork beforehand and really thinking about meaningful questions that you would like to ask to find out more at meetings is really important. And so as a head teacher, I feel, or I hope, that as a chair of governors, I make sure that my governing board know that they're expected to read all the paperwork, that they're expected to contribute to the meetings, and they are all expected to ask questions and to seek clarification about what's written in the report. And I think it's about kind of making connections to different meetings that have happened, different visits that have happened. And it's not about a checklist for the head teacher, making sure that they've done their job. It's more of a discussion and everybody clarifying their understanding and asking really good questions. And the second thing is about the children. And so possibly this is a little bit controversial, but I think we are all absolutely clear that the children need to make sure that they have not missed any of the core subjects in terms of reading and writing and maths. But for me, as a mum and as a teacher, I feel that the thing that the children have probably missed the most is the other areas of the curriculum. So art, DT, music, maybe PE, the subjects that you can't teach or you couldn't prioritize when you were doing learning online. So when we delivered lessons online in school, we were focusing on the absolute critical stuff in reading, writing and maths, pretty much. And so anything that wasn't considered critical was not taught in those lessons. And there is a thought to be given to if they weren't critical and they weren't taught, then where is their position in the curriculum? But I feel the children missed everything else. And I know that for myself and the schools that I've taught, we've always had a big conversation around disadvantaged children. So often that means the children who are eligible for the Pupil Premium funding or free school meals. And I think when you think about those children pre-pandemic, those children are the children that miss out on the other bits in life. So their families struggle maybe financially, and so the children don't have the holidays you would think families did. They don't get to go to the theatre, the cinema, the beach, all the things that maybe other families do. Now, I'm generalising because that isn't the case for all families, but I think that notion of being disadvantaged in that you have free school meals, I feel like that's something that we need to really think about carefully about the children in the pandemic, because all children, therefore, have missed all of that because they've all been in their houses, not doing those things. But the children who are the most disadvantaged are the children who didn't have that before the pandemic and have not had that since lockdown has ended. And so I feel we must not lose sight of the bigger picture for these children. So yes, of course, we are going to be thinking about their reading, their writing, and their maths. But actually, what made children disadvantaged hasn't changed as a definition, but it has changed in terms of the children who might fall into that category. And I think that disadvantaged in terms of their access to trips and visits and seeing things is so important. And I'm not sure if I've got time, but I always think about the sort of example of children in year 5 who are learning about the Greek gods, say, for example, which is something that the children is in the national curriculum. And I think if you have been to a warm country and you've seen the sand and you've seen the desert, then you are able to access information in your short-term memory to learn much more easily than the children who have no experience of a country that is warm, of that feeling of real heat, of the desert, of the sand. And so you are immediately advantaged by having done so. So if you think of the pandemic where children have been mostly inside, the best thing they've probably done is go to the park or Tesco's. I think we are thinking about a whole generation of children who are potentially disadvantaged, and those who are considered disadvantaged on paper in terms of free school meals are absolutely the most disadvantaged. And so I would urge all of you at governors' meetings to really think not just about the results in terms of English, reading, writing and maths, but to think about what else is being offered for these children to catch up and fill the gaps in terms of that disadvantage. And then I suppose I'm going to finish with the fact that the pandemic has been what it has been, but actually for schools it has brought lots of positives and lots of clarification in terms of good ways of working. So, you know, we're all very adept with technology and virtual meetings, and, you know, the community spirit, I think, has been really good. But I think that the governing body need to kind of capitalise on that. And what could we do? I mean, you mentioned about in the 1970s or 90s or whatever it was, and that we had those 4 committees. I think those 4 committees are probably in most governing bodies quite standard. Is there a different way we could do things? So we've changed a lot in schools for children to make it more efficient, more streamlined, better, but maybe we could look at the governing board and think, how could we do it differently? How could we do it better? And I know that my own governing board in my school, we have restructured the whole planner, trying to think about how we can make sure that governors don't have to give up more of their time, but we can use it better so that they're involved more in the school development plan, more in the data analysis, more in book looks, looking at the children learning walk, all of those things, but still within the kind of context of 2 meetings a term. So I don't feel like these children are a lost generation. at all. I feel like they are going to be the product of a generation that looks at things differently and does it better. But I hope that governing boards keep up with that, and they also look at things differently and think about how governing boards can do things better, and learn from that and streamline and improve their practices too. I apologise for not having any slides. As I said, I'm just so busy. I'm working on a minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day basis. And I think one of the things that I feel when I go to governance meetings as a head teacher is lots of questions about staff well-being and mental health. And I feel like we have in schools done everything to make sure the teachers and the staff are okay. But I do feel there has been an oversight in terms of the well-being and mental health of the senior leadership team. And I think of myself and my senior leaders, where we have worked every single day since March the 20th, 2022, or 20, sorry, like years in advance. We picked up food every weekend, every evening, in the morning, and our actual workload hasn't changed. We still have to do that, but our day-to-day job has changed magnificently in that we are much more helping families just get through the day, the week, the month. And the other jobs, like the school improvement plan, like the school evaluation form, all of those things still have to be done, but they are not the priority of the senior leadership team. They are something that we will do. And actually, we're worried about the children having enough clothes, they've got enough food, the parents are okay, that they're coming to school, where are they last night? And I think governing bodies have got to think about the leadership team as well as the whole teaching staff, and their mental health and well-being. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Kirstie. That was really insightful. Thank you. I've got some questions, and I do actually have one that probably really good if you could answer, Kirstie, around school visits. I know you mentioned them at the start. So given that the governors have probably not been able to conduct visits in school, is there something that you could give a tip or advice about how best to re-engage with schools in that area?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think most schools would welcome visits from governors. I think we have felt the absence of governors in schools, and I think it's difficult for you to see. It was 18 months ago. That's a very long time. And if you think of the 3-year-olds in nursery, for example, that is half of their lives. So I think absolutely governors must come into schools, and the kind of wider world outside of schools is maybe still working very much at home. But I think it's so important for our staff to see governors in schools. Some of us have had very difficult conversations with staff about having to come into school. And I think if governors are not prepared as the leaders and managers of schools to come into school, then it does make it difficult about those conversations that we have had previously with staff.
Thank you. Okay. Question for Sujal. Not all governors need to be expert in every competency. Obviously, that would be a bit of an impossibility. However, how do we ensure that there's sufficient and robust competence across the whole governing board? So I guess thinking about skills audits and things like that, I suppose.
Obviously, the skills audit helps, but the other thing is allocation, isn't it? It's allocation of resources, like with everything. So if you have a link governor to do different things, or if you, during the committee, for example, make sure that different people are overseeing. For example, in one of our finance committees, we have one person who does the benchmarking, while one person looks at the budget. So the jobs are divided. And again, if we also have many schools who don't have committees and are only doing the model that Steve has suggested, that we only have governing board meetings. And with those, it's particularly important that roles are divided. And I think as a chair, you need to be mindful to not take everything on board yourself. And here again, succession planning comes into place, because if you have a good system of succession planning, then you've already got a model in place to divide the roles, if you like. So I hope that that answers. And absolutely, you can't have everybody doing everything.
Sure, definitely something to think about how the board is made up and how you use those committees if you do. Excellent, thank you. We have a question about safeguarding, and I guess with the recent information about peer-on-peer abuse and things like that, should all governors now be reading all of Keeping Children Safe in Education, or sticking to what's been required of them previously? I'll ask that to Steve.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. It's not an uncommon question. It's one I've been asked several times in the last couple of weeks. There is no mandatory requirement on governors to actually read part 1 or part 2, as I'm sure most of your listeners will actually recognise. But this is about good practice. We're talking about good governance, effective governance this afternoon. Safeguarding is nothing could be more important as far as those young children and young people in our schools are concerned. And I think governors have an obligation to treat it seriously. There have been so many changes, I think, in the new version of Keeping Children Safe. Good practice for me is, yes, I would expect them not to become word perfect on it. That's not the intention here, but certainly to be aware of the changes that have actually taken place, certainly to be aware of those key priorities, peer-on-peer abuse being one of them. County lines doesn't go away, of course, child criminal exploitation, nor does the prevent duty. And of course, as I'm sure Kirstie will say, in most schools, neglect and the other forms of abuse that present themselves day in, day out, that's part of the bread and butter of leadership. And therefore, I think it's important that governors actually understand, we don't need to know names, we don't need to know which year groups or anything like that, but what are the sort of safeguarding influences that shape the culture, not the culture, sorry, shape the context of the individual schools. I think that's crucial. So for me, I would actually say to governors, you need either your designated safeguarding lead to talk you through what the key changes are, certainly read as much as you possibly can, or there are plenty of summaries online which talk to you about the changes. But so I wouldn't necessarily mandate it, but I would say the best governing bodies will be asking governors to ensure that they are familiar with the new version of Keeping Children Safe. Okay,
thank you. We have got lots of questions and we're running out of time very rapidly. One about benchmarking, I guess about performance. For the last 2 years, I've missed national benchmarking and year-on-year in-school comparisons. How would the panel suggest governors gauge performance in that context? So if I could come to each of you in turn, so around performance, obviously without the without national benchmarking because of the exams. I'll come to you, Sujal, first.
What we've done here actually is we get schools to pair up with similar schools and share that data, and that's the only way we've been able to do it.
Really important then to have those links with other schools, I guess.
Absolutely.
And you're in a multi-trust, it's one thing, but yeah.
I'll pick up on something that Kirstie said. Absolutely, it's been, I presume, and from what I have seen, it's been particularly difficult on head teachers, and it's been quite lonely. So I hope that most chairs of governors have been there for the head teachers. And similarly, when we share things like benchmarking, it does improve that sort of comradeship between head teachers in the same area, or there are schools that share the same kind of makeup.
Sure, thank you. I'll come to you next, Kirstie.
So in terms of benchmarking, do you mean the actual technical, as in
data,
TAs, or the data of
the data? I think, yeah.
So I feel really concerned as a head teacher about this academic year and what might pan out. So I work in a primary school. My daughter also happens to be in year 6, and I feel extremely anxious about what might happen if there are key stage tests that are statutory, because I think the schools have a lot riding on them to perhaps operate at pre-pandemic results levels, given these children have missed 18 months of school. And as a mum, my worry is that my daughter will feel the pressure, inadvertently perhaps, that her teachers feel about getting results that were pre-pandemic. And I think we have to be really realistic about what we can expect of the children and what we can expect of the schools, and how much preparation goes into the results for those children. And I have to say, I feel very anxious about that as a professional and as a mum, and how that will all pan out this year. And we don't know. The key stage 2 tests are going to take place. We assume they are, but they can't possibly be expected to do the same tests that 2 years, 3 years ago did. And we can't possibly expect the same kind of results. And I don't know how that's all going to pan out. And I guess it must be quite similar at secondary, but I can only speak from my own.
Thank you. Steve, did you have any last comments? It is 2 minutes past now, so just anything to wrap us up with?
I would agree with everything that Kirstie and Sujal have actually said. The only thing I would say is, as governors, I think it's absolutely vital that you recall, and again, this is really coming into Kirstie's territory, that every cohort of children, every year group of children, they're different children. So to try and emulate what you did last year, what you did the year before, I'm not sure that's important. So benchmarking for me, if you want to look back and see what the school did, not what the children did, what the school did and what the school achieved in 2019, that's the last time we've got data. But never lose sight of the fact they're not the same children. Those children have had, as Kirstie said, very, very different experiences. What we should be asking as governors is, what does assessment tell teachers where those children are now, and what do they need to be taught tomorrow to fill some of those buckets that maybe haven't been filled along the journey?
Thank you ever so much. Excellent. We have still got questions, but we'll try and answer those offline following the session. Just to let everybody know, we've got a couple of sessions coming up over the week, which might be of particular interest. So Steve already plugged his at tomorrow at 8 o'clock, which is about hot topics in governance. If you're a community school that's looking to move to academisation, we've got a session with the Confederation Schools Trusts on Wednesday at 1:15. And on Friday at 4 o'clock, we are launching our new campaign, All Pupils, Every Ambition. So please do join us for that one if you can. Thanks ever so much. Sorry that we slightly overran, but so many questions still out there that we needed to get to. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. We hope you enjoyed it, and have a lovely evening, everybody. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.